On the eve of our wedding, I stood outside the interrogation room, watching my fiancée Elsie Wakeley inside. Wilfred, how can you be so heartless? I was just helping Crispin out of a tough spot, she screamed at me hoarsely. I gazed at her, my heart turning to ashes. It seemed that all those 1,000 nights of devotion meant less to her than a casual message from Crispin. For the sake of this so-called friend she'd known since university, she was willing to go to nightclubs and keep men company. She could sell herself, and even planned to turn our wedding into a farce to raise money. Wilfred, didn't you say you'd always be by my side? Yes, I did say that once. But now, I only wanted to tell her. Even the deepest love can't withstand endless exploitation. This romance, which had stretched from campus to career, was finally drawing to a close tonight. From this moment on, the words soft-hearted would no longer exist in my vocabulary. Ding! Story Shots reminds you to click the subscribe button at the bottom right corner to read the full novel. Elsie Wakeley raised her head, her eyes filled with disdain. Wilfred, when did you become so petty? You're making such a fuss over a mere £50,000. I clenched my fists. This wasn't about the money at all. Suppressing the anger in my chest, I asked, has Crispin's payday loan been sorted out? She impatiently tossed her hair. It's all because of that cheap woman causing trouble. I was only gone for 10 days and she messed everything up. I couldn't save a single penny. Suddenly, she seemed to have a bright idea. Darling, don't you hate it when I go to the nightclub to entertain? Why don't you help Crispin pay off his debt, and I'll stop going immediately. Look how exhausted I am. My skin's even worse now. She put on a pitiful act. Hearing her speak as if it was all so matter-of-fact, I found it utterly laughable. Last night when Detective Inspector Thompson called, I was worried something had happened to her. When I rushed to the police station, I discovered that Elsie had gotten into a fight with another hostess at the nightclub and injured her with a glass bottle. The other woman demanded compensation for medical expenses and emotional distress, totaling £50,000. After paying the bail, I coldly asked her why she went to the nightclub. Crispin owes money to a payday loan company. I wanted to help him pay it back, she answered casually. Can't Crispin pay his own debts? She glared at me dissatisfied. 50,000 is too much for him. Besides, I chose to go to the nightclub because I was afraid you'd find out how close I am to him. My dreams of the upcoming wedding and my feelings for Elsie completely crumbled at that moment. Crispin was her good friend from university, holding an irreplaceable position in her heart. Lately, she had been constantly finding excuses to ask me for money, and I naively thought she was preparing something for the wedding. It was only now that I saw everything clearly. I immediately notified everyone to cancel tomorrow's wedding. Seeing my silence, Elsie reached out to touch me. I instinctively moved away, and her expression instantly darkened. Wilfred, what do you mean by this? I looked straight into her eyes. Elsie, let's end this. She stared at me in disbelief. You want to break up over something so trivial? Yes, over something so trivial. On the way out of the police station, Elsie kept berating me in my ear, saying I was petty, that I didn't understand love, that I wasn't as generous as Crispin. I chose to ignore her, focusing on driving. Just then, her phone chimed with a notification. It was a WhatsApp message from Crispin. Elsie, they're chasing for the money again. Can you? Seeing this message, I recalled many past incidents. Last year, when I worked overtime until I had a fever, I wanted her to make some chicken soup. She impatiently replied, Do you think I'm your assistant? Can't you just order takeaway? But whenever Crispin said he was hungry, she would immediately drop whatever she was doing to cook for him. I had helped Crispin write business proposals, provided startup funds, and even continued to support him after his project failed. But in Elsie's eyes, I could never compare to his casual words of concern. Back home, I placed the packed suitcase in front of her. All your things are here. Please leave. Wilfred, she trembled all over. How dare you kick me out? I'm not kicking you out. You chose this path yourself. You think I really wanted to marry you? She suddenly sneered. If it wasn't for the fact that you earn a lot at that game company and could help Crispin, I wouldn't have agreed to your proposal." These words hit me like a sledgehammer, yet they completely woke me up. So I was just a carefully placed pawn in her game. My feelings, my efforts, were nothing but a transaction in her eyes. "In that case, please leave immediately." I opened the door, my tone icy. Elsie stood there stunned. She probably never expected that I, who had always indulged her every whim, would say such resolute words. In the end, she left in anger. That night, I saw Crispin's Facebook post. "Someone who always understands your heart. That's true love." The photo showed Elsie wearing his game company's t-shirt, smiling brightly. I liked and commented, "Cherish everything." Soon after, Elsie Wakeley commented on my Facebook post, "Is this your idea of making amends? Crispin and I are starving. If you want me to forgive you, order a Michelin-starred seafood platter and have it delivered right away." A signature set from a 3 Michelin-starred restaurant would cost at least 6 figures. I ignored her, focusing on tidying up my room. 30 minutes later, she called. "Wilfred, are you paralyzed or have you lost your memory? We haven't seen hide nor hair of you for ages," she shouted aggressively. "I'm giving you 5 more minutes. If you don't show up, don't ever expect to see me again." She hung up before finishing her sentence. Staring at my phone screen, I recalled that night of overtime work 3 months ago. She said she wanted to try the newly opened Japanese restaurant. I told her I couldn't leave because the system was about to go live. "If you can't even spare time for dinner with me, it seems you don't care about me anymore. If that's the case, we should break up." That night, I abandoned an important project to accompany her. As a result, a bug appeared in the code, causing the company significant losses. My director berated me until dawn. I messaged her to pick me up. "You can't even manage a simple system properly, yet you expect me to come out in the middle of the night? You're utterly useless." I received a formal warning and spent the entire night in the office. In contrast, when Crispin's computer got infected with a virus, she immediately took time off to help him recover his data, working tirelessly at his desk for 48 hours. Thinking about it now, I realize how foolish I've been, naively hoping she would understand my intentions. My phone lit up again, this time with a WhatsApp message. "Wilfred, if you don't come now, we're going to eat at a street stall. Crispin has a sensitive stomach. Are you deliberately trying to make him ill?" I turned off my phone and continued tidying the room. Moments later, Crispin updated his Facebook status. "Some people only care about their own pride, while ignoring their loved one's hunger pangs." The accompanying photo showed Elsie looking pitiful with a box of convenience store sandwiches. I scoffed. Even if I sent her the most expensive gifts, they wouldn't mean as much to her as the cheap food Crispin bought on a whim. Suddenly, the doorbell rang urgently. Looking through the peephole, I saw Elsie and Crispin standing outside. "Open the door," she shouted, banging on it forcefully. "Wilfred, if you don't open up, I'll let the whole building know what kind of person you are." I opened the door and she immediately barged in. "Clear out the study. Crispin's staying here tonight. The people from the dodgy company have tracked him down. Your place is the most discreet," she said matter-of-factly. "Surely you can do this small favor?" Crispin leaned against the doorframe, flashing me an enigmatic smile. "Cheers, mate. I appreciate it." Elsie Wakeley swaggered into my living room, plopping herself down on the sofa and pulling Crispin Thurlow to sit beside her. Seeing my confused expression, she haughtily announced, "The debt collectors have come knocking. Crispin's staying here for a bit. Clear out the study for him." She paused for a moment, then ordered, "Never mind. I'll sort it myself. You go to the kitchen and cook. Crispin fancies some fish and chips." With that, she dragged Crispin towards the study. As Crispin followed her past me, the corner of his mouth twitched with a faint smile. "Cheers, mate. Much obliged." In the past, such a scene would have been enough to make me fly into a rage. I would have had a blazing row with Elsie, only to end up begging for her forgiveness in hushed tones. But now I felt nothing, watching this pair of conniving lovers finding them both pathetic and laughable. Elsie came out after arranging the room, and seeing me still on the sofa dealing with work emails, she immediately became displeased. "Wilfred, are your ears not working? Didn't you hear me tell you to go cook? Don't tell me you're going to throw a strop over Crispin again. Can't you grow up a bit?" I was about to speak when Crispin sighed, putting on a melancholy face. "Elsie, love, don't quarrel with Wilfred over me. If my being here makes him uncomfortable, I'd better leave. Those debt collectors aren't that big a deal, really." Elsie immediately grabbed his hand, her eyes full of pity. "Don't listen to him. What if those people find you after you leave? I'd be worried sick." When she turned to me, her gaze was filled with contempt and resentment. "Wilfred, how can you be so heartless? If it wasn't for Crispin speaking up for you yesterday, we'd be over by now. Is this how you treat someone who's helped you?" I sneered and said, "Elsie, our relationship is already over. If you two keep making a scene here, I won't hesitate to use other means to ask you to leave." She stared at me in shock, seemingly unable to believe that I, who had once catered to her every whim, would now speak such harsh words. Just as she was about to lash out at me physically as she usually did, Crispin suddenly intervened. He asked Elsie to go make some pasta, saying he wanted to have a private chat with me. She glared at me fiercely but obediently went to the kitchen. I inwardly scoffed. 3 months ago, when I had a fever from working overtime, I asked her to make some porridge. She impatiently replied, "What am I, your assistant? Can't you just order takeaway?" Crispin observed the kitchen noises, making sure Elsie couldn't hear, then said with a smirk, 100 grand. Transfer me 100 grand, and I'll disappear from Elsie's life immediately." I sneered. "You think I'd still give you money now?" He glanced at me contemptuously. "Didn't you love her the most? 100, 200 grand. That's nothing to you, right?" "Sorry, not even a penny." Crispin still looked confident. "Brother, 100 grand for true love. That's a bargain." I stared at his smug face, recalling all his scheming over the years. Rage instantly flooded my brain, and I swung a punch at him. Elsie ran out hearing the commotion, saw Crispin holding his face, and immediately rushed to check his injury, full of concern. She looked at me as if I were her mortal enemy. "Wilfred, have you gone mad? Assaulting someone for no reason?" I laughed coldly. "So what if I have? What are you going to do about it?" Elsie Wakeley bit her lip, her expression uncertain. Clearly, my unusual behavior over the past 2 days had left her unable to control the situation. I couldn't be bothered to deal with her and walked straight towards the master bedroom. Before opening the door, I left her with these words. "When I wake up, you'd better be gone." I slept until past 9 in the evening. When I came out wearing my house slippers, Crispin had already left. To my surprise, Elsie was still sitting on the sofa, staring at me with resentful eyes. She hadn't left with Crispin. I took a craft beer from the fridge, took a few sips and asked, "Aren't you leaving?" Elsie hesitated for a moment, then changed the subject. "When does the project at the German branch start?" I looked at her, confused. "Since it's over, why are we still talking about the project?" She frowned, her tone unfriendly. "Stop being moody. Didn't you always want me to go to Germany with you? So now, tell me the specific time." I looked at her thoughtfully. "Why the sudden interest in Germany?" She sighed deeply, putting on a worried expression. "Crispin's online loans are being chased up. If we go to work in Germany, with the relocation allowance and benefits your company offers, we can definitely help him clear his debts. This way, you'll get your wish of taking me to Germany, and Crispin can solve his problems. Everyone wins. It's best if we leave next week. The longer we delay, the more dangerous it is for Crispin." Since last year, I had been constantly inviting her to develop our careers in Germany together. Elsie always made excuses, saying the timing wasn't right, that Crispin was still single in the UK and she couldn't abandon her friend. But just last month, she suddenly changed her mind and said she was willing to go to Germany with me. I thought she had finally understood my intentions and was ready to start a new life with me. So this was the truth behind it all. I laughed at her shamelessness. Elsie, you've really thought this through, haven't you? Using my relocation allowance to pay off Crispin's debts? Aren't you being a bit naive? She glanced at me arrogantly. My willingness to go to Germany with you is already a huge favor. Do you want to keep all the benefits to yourself? What about your relocation allowance? I asked casually. She rolled her eyes at me impatiently. My share will of course go to my parents. It hasn't been easy for them to raise me all these years. Also, I need £50,000 in advance for relocation expenses. I sneered. You shameless woman. Let me tell you, don't even think about it. Elsie was startled by my unusual reaction, then suddenly seemed to understand something. Wilfred, you're not still hung up on me working at the nightclub, are you? That's just a trivial matter. Crispin doesn't mind, so why are you being so petty? Can't you learn to be as open-minded as him? She said all this with a natural expression, as if I were the unreasonable one. I stood up from the sofa, looking down at her. Elsie, don't expect me to soften just because you're playing the victim. Those days are gone for good. She sprang to her feet, tears welling up in her eyes. Wilfred, you've changed. You used to be so good to me. Just because I worked as a hostess at a nightclub, you despise me and abandon me. You selfish, hypocritical bastard. I'll give you one last chance. If you don't agree to go to Germany, I'll go find Crispin right now and deal with those creditors together. Seeing her unreasonable behavior, I also lost my patience completely. Get the fuck out of here. Remember, even if you were the last woman on earth, I wouldn't give you a second glance. Disgusting, utterly disgusting. She trembled all over, grabbed her handbag and headed for the door. Before leaving, she didn't forget to throw one last spiteful remark. You'll regret this. Watching her slam the door shut, I opened my laptop and edited an email. It was an email I had been holding back for 6 months. With the subject, application for senior research and development engineer position at German headquarters. The next morning, I was startled awake by an urgent knocking on my door. Opening it, I found my parents standing outside. As soon as he entered, my father began to lecture me. Wilfred, Elsie says you're refusing to work in Germany over some trivial matter. Are you treating your career like a game? I turned to see Elsie Wakeley standing smugly behind my parents. I had gone to such lengths to make my parents accept her, and now it had all become her leverage to manipulate me. I ushered my parents into the living room. Mom, Dad, please have a seat. I'll go freshen up and change. Then we can talk in detail. Before closing the bedroom door, I gave Elsie a meaningful look. She immediately flashed a victorious smile, as if she had me all figured out. I deliberately took 20 minutes to emerge. Elsie was putting on an act of being pitiful, complaining to my mother and constantly calling them Mom and Dad. Couldn't help but sneer. She was really going all out for Crispin's sake. Before, she would always make excuses when I invited her to dine with my parents, but now she was acting all chummy. Seeing me standing still, my father urged me to quickly apologize to Elsie. I had barely taken 2 steps when the doorbell rang again. Elsie looked at me quizzically. I gave her a knowing smile. When I opened the door, Elsie's face turned pale as she saw who it was. Dad, Mom, what are you doing here? Her voice trembled. Mrs. Wakeley said. Wilfred said there was an urgent matter to discuss. Ignoring Elsie's meaningful glances, I said with satisfaction, now that both sets of parents are here, I do indeed have something to say about going to Germany. Wilfred, Elsie snapped. Both sets of parents looked at me in confusion. I cleared my throat and got straight to the point. Just yesterday, Elsie got into an altercation while entertaining at a nightclub and was taken in by the police for questioning. That's not true. Don't listen to his nonsense. Mom and Dad, Elsie quickly denied. I placed the copy of the police report Detective Sergeant Thompson had given me on the coffee table. Mr. and Mrs. Wakeley's faces instantly darkened. Mr. Wakeley could no longer contain himself. He stood up and slapped Elsie across the face. Elsie, how could you do such a thing? You've brought shame on your mother and me. Mrs. Wakeley gazed at her daughter with tear-filled eyes, unable to utter a word. Elsie, say something, Mr. Wakeley roared. My parents sat awkwardly to the side, unsure of what to do. Mrs. Wakeley choked out, Wilfred, tell Auntie, why did she do this? Elsie looked at me with pleading eyes. I stared directly at her and said slowly and deliberately, because Crispin owes a payday loan company £100,000, and she wanted to help him pay it back. Mr. and Mrs. Wakeley were shocked by this revelation. Mr. Wakeley pointed at Elsie, trembling with anger. Elsie, didn't I warn you to stay away from Crispin? Hearing this, Elsie suddenly lost control. Just because his dad swindled you out of £15,000? What does that have to do with Crispin? He's been my only friend since childhood. Not helping him would be ungrateful. It was then that I understood why Elsie always insisted I not mention Crispin whenever we visited her family. Elsie glared at me viciously. I just wanted to use the Germany allowance to help Crispin pay off his debt. It wouldn't have cost you anything. You're just jealous of him and want him dead. I responded with a cold smirk, not bothering to reply. Mrs. Wakeley pulled Elsie towards the door. You're coming home with me. Stay put and don't come out to embarrass us. Elsie struggled desperately. No, Mom. Crispin will be beaten to death if he can't pay. As the two grappled, Elsie lost her balance and pushed Mrs. Wakeley to the ground. Mrs. Wakeley's head hit the edge of the coffee table hard, and blood immediately began to flow. The living room fell silent in an instant. Elsie stood frozen, tears silently streaming down her face. Mom! Mom! Elsie Wakeley tried to step forward to support her mother, but was violently pushed away by her father. Get away from me! What a curse this is! How could your mother and I have given birth to such a wretched thing? Elsie wanted to check her mother's injuries but dared not approach. I immediately found my car keys and escorted Mrs. Wakeley to the hospital along with Mr. Wakeley. On the way, Mrs. Wakeley wept silently, seemingly oblivious to the pain of her wounds. Mr. Wakeley, while tending to his wife, didn't forget to apologize to me. Please don't say that, Mr. Wakeley. Getting Mrs. Wakeley to the hospital is the priority. We can discuss other matters later. After examination, the doctor stated it was only a mild concussion and a few days of observation in the hospital would suffice. I settled the medical expenses first, then rushed to the Wakeley home to gather the necessities for the hospital stay. When I returned home, Elsie had already left. My parents were still sitting in the living room waiting for me. Wilfred, you and Elsie. My mother hesitated. I shook my head gently. Mom, it's all over. After seeing my parents off, I refreshed my social media and saw a post from Crispin. Don't worry, darling. I'll protect you. The accompanying picture showed Elsie curled up on the sofa in his rented flat. Early the next morning, Elsie came to collect her belongings. She frantically banged on my door. Wilfred Sparrow, get out here. I opened the door impatiently, and she immediately raised her hand to slap me. I swiftly restrained her wrist. How dare you tell my parents? She screamed hoarsely. Now they've disowned me. Are you satisfied? I was just trying to help Crispin. Why can't you understand? I stared at her coldly. Your choice to help him is yours, but you shouldn't have involved my parents. She froze for a moment, then continued to make excuses. I kept it from you before because I was afraid you'd be jealous. I only wanted to use the Germany stipend to help him pay off his debts. You refused to go to Germany, so I had no choice but to ask Uncle and Auntie. Besides, aren't you my boyfriend? Isn't it natural to help my best friend? Hearing her say such shameless words, I couldn't help but laugh. I had introduced Crispin to his job, found the flat, and even paid the monthly rent. Every time we went on a date, our world for two would become a world for three. She said she couldn't leave Crispin alone at home. Once I took her to an old restaurant near the university, and Crispin didn't come. She said he was being considerate and didn't want to intrude, then accused me of being petty. After that, I never took her to any fancy restaurants again. Wilfred, let me explain. She tried to make more excuses. I cut her off. I've already accepted the offer from the German headquarters. Elsie was stunned. You're really going to Germany? Yes, I leave the day after tomorrow. No! She suddenly became hysterical. Crispin's debts aren't settled yet. How can you leave? I snorted. How is that my concern? You! She trembled with anger. You've changed. You used to care for me so much. I stared at her out-of-control state, as if looking at a stranger. Was this really the woman I had loved for 3 years? Elsie, remember this clearly. From this moment on, Crispin's affairs are your affairs, and have nothing to do with me. She glared at me with tears in her eyes. You're determined to leave? Flight's the day after tomorrow. What about Crispin? I finally couldn't suppress my anger. Is he that important? Of course he's important. He's my lifelong best friend, she answered righteously. I pushed open the door. Then go find your best friend. Wilfred, she screamed behind me. If you dare leave, I'll go pay off Crispin's debts. You know what kind of people those debt collectors are. I turned to face her. Is that a threat? It's a reminder of the consequences, she said with a cold smile. Don't you love me the most? I shook my head and sighed. Elsie, you're overestimating yourself. After Elsie left, I began to pack my belongings. Suddenly, my mobile rang, displaying an unknown number. Hello, is this Mr. Sparrow? This is the A&E department of Royal London Hospital. Yes, speaking. Miss Wakeley has been in a traffic accident. She listed you as her emergency contact. My hand involuntarily tightened around the phone. How long ago did this happen? About 30 minutes ago. She's currently in emergency treatment. When I arrived at the hospital, Crispin was already there waiting. He rushed towards me as soon as he saw me. Wilfred, please save Elsie. What exactly happened? Elsie said she was going to negotiate with some debt collectors. I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. He paced anxiously on the spot. She followed those people in her car, and then, the red light above the emergency room was still on. Crispin walked back and forth in the corridor, occasionally glancing at me. Wilfred, tell me Elsie will be all right, won't you? I ignored him and dialed Elsie's father's number. After an agonizing 3 hours, the emergency room doors finally opened. The attending physician said Elsie was temporarily out of danger, but needed further observation. Mr. Sparrow, the patient will need a full examination when she regains consciousness. The doctor hesitated, then continued. We found some abnormalities during routine checks. What abnormalities? Well, the physician glanced at Crispin. The patient's blood test came back positive for HPV. Further testing is needed. I felt my mind go blank. HPV, a virus primarily transmitted through intimate contact. Crispin's face turned ashen. Elsie was still unconscious when she was wheeled into the ward. After Elsie's father arrived, the doctor handed him the test results to review. His hands trembled uncontrollably. Crispin! Elsie's father grabbed him by the collar. Is this your doing? Crispin vehemently denied it. It wasn't me. Nothing happened between Elsie and me. Then how did she? Uncle. Crispin suddenly fell to his knees. I took Elsie to a nightclub. The owner said we could make big money just by drinking and chatting with customers. Elsie's father struck him hard across the face. You beast! How dare you harm my daughter? I'll never forgive you. Crispin stumbled away, clutching his face. Elsie's father took a few steps to chase him, then collapsed to the ground, powerless. I helped him up. Mr. Wakeley, let's check on Elsie first. Elsie didn't regain consciousness until the following afternoon. Seeing the people in her room, she paused for a moment. Dad! Her father turned away. Wilfred! She called out weakly. I walked straight towards the door. Don't go! She tried to grab me, but the movement pulled at her injuries, making her wince in pain. Why won't you let Crispin come see me? I stopped in my tracks. You're still thinking about him? You really deserve this. Elsie, I turned to face her. Do you know what disease you've contracted? She looked at me blankly. HPV. Your good friend Crispin took you to entertain clients, and as a result, you were… I couldn't continue. Her eyes widened in shock. That's impossible. Crispin said it was just drinking and chatting. He promised. You believe everything he says? I scoffed. Did you think it would be that easy to pay off online loans? Elsie's face turned pale. No, you're lying to me. The test results are right here. I placed the report on her bedside table. See for yourself. She trembled as she opened the report, tears falling onto the paper. I'm sorry, she sobbed. Wilfred, I'm so sorry. I stared at her. How long have you known Crispin? Since primary school. Do you know what his job is? She shook her head. He doesn't have a job at all. He's been working as a tout at nightclubs. Those so-called online loans were all a trap set by him and the nightclub owner. No, it's not like that. She tried to sit up, agitated. Crispin isn't that kind of person. Oh, I played a recording on my phone. It was a conversation between Crispin and the nightclub owner. They were plotting to get Elsie to entertain clients, and once she got used to it, they'd arrange for her to provide more intimate services. Crispin said my family was well off, and I'd surely pay to get her out when the time came. Detective Inspector Arkwright had given me this recording. She said she couldn't stand by and watch anymore, that Crispin had already ruined several girls like this. After hearing the recording, Elsie's entire body shook violently. Elsie spent 4 full weeks recovering in the hospital. During this time, the police successfully dismantled the criminal syndicate operating out of the nightclub where Crispin worked. The investigation revealed that they habitually targeted young women from affluent backgrounds, using various methods to trap them in difficult situations, ultimately forcing them into prostitution to earn money. Crispin was specifically responsible for finding targets, and had already victimized 7 girls. Upon learning all this, Elsie was on the verge of a mental breakdown. She kept blaming herself, saying she was too stupid, that she deserved what happened to her. I came to the hospital every day, but only stood silently outside her door for a moment. One day, Elsie's mother stopped me. Wilfred, would you please go in and keep Elsie company? I politely declined. Mrs. Wakeley, I'm leaving the day after tomorrow. Have you really decided to go to Germany? Yes. The head office is waiting for me. Mrs. Wakeley sighed deeply. Elsie has always been stubborn since she was little, never listening to advice once she's made up her mind. She trusted Crispin too much. I consoled her. Mrs. Wakeley, everything will pass. Can you? I understood her meaning. Mrs. Wakeley, some opportunities, once missed, never come again. The next day, I entered the hospital room for the last time. Elsie was on an 4-drip. She froze when she saw me come in. Are you really leaving? She asked softly. I nodded slightly. Can we? She bit her lower lip. Have a chance to start over? Elsie? I looked at her intently. Do you understand why I accepted the job in Germany so quickly? She shook her head. Because in your eyes, I was never as important as Crispin. That's not true. She rushed to explain. I was just too dependent on him. Stop making excuses. I cut her off. You'd rather believe a liar than trust me? She lowered her head. I regret it. I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. Don't apologize, I said calmly. We should both start new lives. But can't you? It's impossible. My attitude was firm. Some paths must be walked alone. She broke down in tears. I really regret it. If you regret it, then learn from it. I turned to leave. Take care. Wilfred, she called out behind me. Will you ever come back to England? I didn't answer, gently closing the door behind me. The next morning, I boarded the flight to Germany. Before takeoff, Mrs. Wakeley sent me a message. Wilfred, thank you for taking care of Elsie during this time. She has recognized many of her issues and is actively trying to change. I wish you all the best in Germany. I replied, Thank you, Mrs. Wakeley. Please take care. As the plane ascended, I gazed out at the sea of clouds, memories flooding back. I remembered when I first met Elsie, smiling and greeting me in front of the office building. I remembered staying late at work with her, her tired head resting on my shoulder. I remembered her being hospitalized with a fever, playfully asking me to feed her medicine. I remembered how excited I was, unable to sleep all night, when she agreed to spend her life with me. I also remembered how, time and again, she hurt me for Crispin's sake. The flight attendant approached with a trolley. "Sir, would you like a drink?" "2 whiskeys, please." I raised my glass to the clouds, to the past, to tomorrow, and most of all, to myself. From now on, a brand new life begins. No more Elsie, no more troubles, only a bright future ahead. Suddenly, my phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "Have a safe flight. I'm so sorry. Please take care." I glanced at it, then switched on airplane mode. During my first month in Germany, I threw myself entirely into work. The intensity at headquarters far exceeded my expectations, with each day filled with demanding tasks. Yet, I found joy in it, as focusing on work temporarily dispelled the gloom in my heart. Until one day when I encountered Audrey at the supermarket. She was the technical director of the R&D department, a British German who spoke impeccable English. "I always see you shopping alone," she smiled and asked. I shrugged. "Living alone, it's simpler this way." She winked. "What a coincidence, me too. How about dinner together?" And so we developed a habit of dining together every weekend. Audrey was particularly tactful, never prying into my past. 6 months later, Mrs. Wakeley sent a message. "Wilfred, Elsie has been accepted for further studies abroad. She says she wants a brand new life. Thank you for what you said before." I stared at the screen, lost in thought. Audrey approached with a hot cup of coffee. "Missing home?" "No." I forced a smile, just reminiscing about the past. She seemed to understand. "Ex-girlfriend issues?" I looked at her in surprise. "How did you guess?" "Your expression," she said. "Like you're gazing at a memory that's now in the past." I put away my phone. "Indeed, it's all over now," Audrey said softly. "Life always has new chapters waiting for us." Looking into her clear eyes, I felt a warmth rising within me. Another 6 months later, at the company celebration, Audrey came to my side wearing an elegant dress. "Care for a dance?" She extended her hand. I hesitated a bit. "I'm not a good dancer." "Don't worry." She took my hand. "Just follow my lead." As the music started and I gazed at her radiant smile, I had an epiphany. True affection is about mutual support, not one-sided demands. It's about guiding each other towards light, not dragging one another into darkness. It's about growing and progressing together, not holding each other back. A year later, Audrey and I walked down the aisle. The wedding was simple and intimate, with only close friends and family as witnesses. Audrey nestled against me, whispering, "I've finally found the most important person in my life." I gazed into her clear eyes, and I found my true home. That night, I cleared all photos and messages related to Elsie Wakeley, not to erase the past, but to welcome a brand new future. Some people are destined to remain only in our memories. Some paths we must walk alone. But the most beautiful love always blossoms at the right time.